Good evening, my dear friends, and welcome to tonight's journey into the intriguing, sometimes eerie, yet utterly fascinating world of medieval beauty standards. I invite you to settle in, perhaps dim the lights, and make yourself comfortable as we step back in time to a period where beauty was measured not by the standards we know today, but by strange and often dangerous ideals. Picture yourself curled up in your favorite chair or nestled in bed, with the soft hum of the evening wrapping around you like a gentle embrace. Let go of the day's stresses, take a deep breath, and allow your mind to wander with me through the corridors of history. Tonight, we will explore a world where beauty was both a statement of status and a symbol of purity, where looking delicate and fragile was a sign of wealth, while the common folk toiled under the harsh rays of the sun, their tans marking them as laborers. It's a world where perfection could only be achieved through painstaking effort, and where the pursuit of beauty sometimes came at a very steep price, quite literally, your health and, at times, your life. But don't worry, you won't be walking this path alone. I'll guide you through these ancient customs, using soft words and a calm rhythm, perfect for drifting into a peaceful slumber. Before we begin, I encourage you to take a moment to relax your body. Close your eyes if that feels right for you, and feel the tension of the day slowly melting away, leaving behind only a sense of calm and tranquility. Imagine the world around you becoming quieter, as though the night itself is cocooning you in a gentle, protective silence. The medieval world, though distant in time, can feel incredibly close when you allow yourself to step into the atmosphere it created. In the Middle Ages, beauty was not simply about looking good. It was about telling a story of wealth, of nobility, of purity, and sometimes a story of illness and toxicity. Pale skin, for instance, was a coveted symbol of high social standing. The sun, that great golden orb above, was something the upper classes could afford to avoid. Their pale, often ghostly complexions were a silent announcement to the world. I am so wealthy that I never need to work in the fields. I need never to feel the harshness of the Sunday. And while today we might associate glowing skin with health and vitality, back then, the paler, the better a stark contrast to the healthy bronzed skin we see celebrated in our modern age. You might be wondering how one could achieve such an ethereal glow. Well, in medieval times, there was no quick fix like sunscreen or SPF lotions, no carefully crafted serums or restorative facials. No, achieving a porcelain complexion required methods that would seem almost unthinkable to us today. Lead powder, mercury-based cosmetics, and even vinegar were used to bleach the skin, giving it a ghostly sheen, but at a dire cost. Lead, that very thing we now use to seal off old buildings to prevent exposure, was once the key to achieving that smooth, perfect complexion. The irony, of course, is that it slowly poisoned those who used it, a slow, invisible death wrapped in the pursuit of beauty. Imagine, if you will, the delicate, translucent nature of the skin these noble women strived for. It was as though they were floating, half in this world, half in the next, a world where their faces, painted with white lead, gleamed with an almost spectral beauty. And yet, despite the obvious risks, it was a coveted look, the price of beauty and nobility. The pursuit of this aesthetic was not just physical, but also symbolic. Those who could afford the luxury of delicate, pale skin were often not just wealthy, but completely disengaged from the gritty work of the common folk. The more fragile you appeared, the more others saw you as a member of the noble class, untouched, untainted by the earth. As we drift through these strange times, envision the noble women of the age. Their faces, often so pale they appeared ghostly, would be adorned with the faintest hints of color, a blush on the cheeks, perhaps as if they just stepped outside for a mere moment before retreating back to the safety of their shadowy chambers. How did they achieve this color? Well, just as with their pale faces, the pursuit of blush was not about healthy, glowing skin. No, it was about achieving the right flush one that suggested youthful vitality, but not too much of it, too much color, and you might be accused of vanity. Heaven forbid. Subtlety was key. Beetroot juice, crushed berries, or even, in some cases, crushed insects were applied to the cheeks, all in the name of enhancing one's appearance, though, of course. Those toxins were quietly seeping into their skin. Now, allow your mind to wander a little further as we explore another ideal of the time, the high forehead. Yes, you heard that correctly. The larger the forehead, the more elegant you were considered. And how did they achieve this lofty look? Through the painful removal of eyebrows and even hairlines. Yes, the hairline itself was often pushed back with such dedication that some women would have to pluck or even remove hair from their scalps, inch by inch, in their quest for an uninterrupted expanse of forehead. Imagine the time and effort spent in this endeavor, all for the sake of beauty and the ideal of refinement. How serene they must have looked, with expressions so smooth and unbroken, like porcelain dolls, except the dolls were real, and the price for such beauty was high. But it wasn't just women who followed these rituals. Men, too, participated in these peculiar beauty ideals, especially in the later medieval and early Renaissance courts. They, too, would use powders to achieve that smooth, pale complexion. It wasn't just about looks, though. The very presence of these noble men and women was meant to convey power, wealth, and yes, even divine favor. After all, a healthy glow might suggest you had been outdoors, working in the fields. But a pale, smooth complexion? That suggested you were meant for higher things, spiritual things, perhaps. Your delicate, untouched skin was proof of your divine grace. As we float through this medieval dreamscape, allow yourself to relax into these images. Picture yourself drifting deeper into this historical reverie, surrounded by soft candlelight, the rustling of tapestries on castle walls, and the faint, distant sounds of courtly music. Let the whispers of history carry you forward as we explore how these beauty standards shaped lives, destinies, and even the course of history itself. And now, my dear friend, with a deep breath and a peaceful mind, we are ready to step even further into the past. So, close your eyes and let the rhythm of the night guide you as we delve deeper into the strange, fascinating, and sometimes toxic world of medieval beauty standards. As we sink deeper into the night, floating through the quiet corridors of history, we find ourselves arriving in a world far different from our own. A world where beauty was not just skin deep, but layered with meaning, status, and occasionally poisons. The pursuit of beauty in medieval times was a delicate and dangerous dance, where looking delicate, fragile, and pale was the highest aspiration one could achieve. But before we wander too far into this strange land of beauty rituals, let's pause for a moment and take a breath. Imagine yourself there, in a noble court, surrounded by tapestries of deep, rich hues, the soft flicker of candlelight casting shadows on stone walls. The air smells faintly of roses and incense, and the faint sounds of a lute or harp can be heard from another room. And there, in the midst of it all, are the noble women and men, their skin as pale as the moonlight streaming through the high, narrow windows. Yes, pale skin. It was the ultimate symbol of wealth, purity, and most importantly, nobility. The medieval world was not one where tanning lotions or spray tans existed. nor were there any sunbeds to catch a quick golden glow. Instead, the only way to achieve a radiant complexion, one that made others gaze in awe, was to avoid the sun entirely. And this, my friends, was not just a matter of personal preference. It was a statement, a loud and clear proclamation to the world that you had wealth, you had status, and above all, you had the luxury of never stepping outside to endure the sun's cruel rays. Now, imagine for a moment what life must have been like for those who lived in the midst of this obsession with pale beauty. For the aristocracy, it was not enough to merely be pale. No, it had to be the right kind of pale, an almost ethereal, ghostly white, a skin tone so light, so translucent, it seemed as if the person might evaporate into thin air at any moment, or be mistaken for a marble statue brought to life. In the world of the medieval elite, being pale was synonymous with being pure, untouchable, and most certainly not in any way related to the sun's harsh light. For the common folk, however, the sun was a constant companion. To be tan meant that you worked outside, that you plowed the fields, tended the cattle, and did all the things that required hard, honest labor under the hot, relentless Sunday. And with that tan came the unmistakable badge of poverty. Imagine, then, how the pale aristocrats must have looked at those outside their lofty walls, poor souls, who had no choice but to labor in the fields. Tan skin on the peasants wasn't just a physical trait. It was a social signifier of their position, a loud marker that they were not of the noble class, but rather part of the vast sea of toiling workers. How lucky the aristocrats must have felt to avoid that fate, to live a life where their skin would remain as pale and pristine as alabaster, untouched by the Sunday. This obsession with paleness was, of course, not a simple matter of staying indoors. No. Achieving that flawless porcelain complexion was a carefully crafted process, often involving strange and hazardous ingredients. The quest for beauty during this time, like many beauty trends throughout history, was more about the illusion of perfection than the reality of health or well-being. In fact, one might say that medieval beauty was not about looking healthy, it was about looking otherworldly. To achieve this coveted pale look, noble men and women used lead-based powders, vinegar, and even crushed pearls. Yes, pearls, those beautiful, glimmering treasures that the sea offers, were ground into fine dust and applied to the skin in hopes of achieving a ghostly radiance that could rival the moon itself. And for those who wanted a truly luminous appearance, the application of white lead was the ultimate technique. Picture it. Delicate hands, painted in the finest silks, carefully applying the white powder to their faces, necks, and chests. Each brushstroke a step closer to achieving the desired pale perfection. The result was skin that looked as though it had never seen the light of day. A smooth, matte finish that, in the most unfortunate cases, would eventually flake and peel off, exposing the damage done beneath. But what's a little blistering and decay in the name of beauty, right? After all, if you're going to be admired from afar, surely a few little side effects were a small price to pay for being considered the very picture of aristocratic elegance. Yet, even in the face of these toxic methods, the pursuit of pale skin was a form of silent rebellion. It was an act of defiance, a clear rejection of the hardships and realities of manual labor, and instead an embrace of the fragility that could only come with wealth and idleness. The more pale one appeared, the more fragile they seemed, and fragility, it turned out, was a mark of nobility. To be fragile was to be above the work of the world below. It meant you were so far removed from the toil of the common folk that the very thought of sweating beneath the sun seemed almost beneath you. But the desire for pale skin wasn't simply a matter of vanity. No, it was a deep-seated cultural norm, one that was written into the very fabric of medieval literature. In poems and romantic tales of the time, women were often described as being pale as milk, white as snow, or in one particularly evocative description, the moon in winter. These poetic images were not merely meant to describe a woman's complexion. They were a reflection of her social status, her purity, her noble blood. Pale skin in these stories was the visual shorthand for something deeper, for class, for nobility, for distance from the common folk who labored in the Sunday. Indeed, as much as the pale skin trend was about achieving beauty, it was just as much about signaling one's place in the social hierarchy. The pale aristocrat stood in stark contrast to the tan peasant, just as the delicate porcelain skin signified the person's unblemished moral character, untouched by the grime and sweat of working the land. And it wasn't just about women. Men too dabbled in this practice, especially as courtly life began to favor aesthetics over the practicalities of battle. By the later years of the medieval period and into the early Renaissance, men too were seen dabbing their faces with the same powders, striving for that ideal of delicate aristocratic beauty. It became just as important for men to maintain their social status through their appearance as it was for women, though of course, they didn't need to go as far as removing their eyebrows to achieve the look. It wasn't just the powders that were used to mimic fragility and grace. The pursuit of delicate skin led to the use of another peculiar practice, painting veins onto the skin. Yes, you read that correctly. Some noble women, determined to look even more fragile, would paint faint blue veins onto their arms, chest, and neck, hoping to give the illusion that their skin was so delicate that it might burst open at the slightest touch. The idea was that by simulating these veins, the wearer could appear even more ethereal, as though they were a creature of air, weightless and untouchable, as if their skin were a mere veil between them and the very spirit world itself. Of course, all of this didn't go unnoticed in the world of literature. As we've already seen, romantic poets would frequently describe their ideal women in terms of their pale complexion, comparing them to the moon, to snow, to milk. These references weren't just compliments, they were part of the cultural currency of the time, a shorthand that indicated both beauty and status. The more pale, the more aristocratic. The more fragile, the more pure. And yet, even with all these efforts to remain pale, there was an understanding, an acknowledgement that this look was not entirely natural. People knew that achieving the pale as porcelain look required more than just staying out of the sun. It required effort, it required time, and it certainly required more than a little bit of chemical intervention. The reality behind these idealized images was often a far cry from the glowing beauty depicted in paintings or poems. The lead powder that graced the skin of the wealthy wasn't just a symbol of beauty, it was a silent, slow poison. But for the nobility, the price was worth it. Better to suffer a little in the name of beauty than risk being mistaken for a peasant with the audacity to show a healthy tan. As we continue our journey deeper into the strange and treacherous world of medieval beauty standards, I encourage you to let the flickering candlelight of the past guide you, slowly, gracefully, to a place where beauty comes at an unexpected and, at times, dangerous cost. If the quest for pale skin was not enough to transport us to an era where nobility was defined by fragility, then perhaps what lies ahead will shed some light on the real cost of beauty, one that not even the most delicate of porcelain faces could escape. For you see, dear friends, to achieve the look of ethereal, flawless, deathly pale skin, the wealthy and noble of medieval Europe turned to a most unusual and poisonous tool, lead-based cosmetics. Now remember, this isn't a time of high-end serums or SPF 50 sunscreen. Oh no, far from it. In the medieval world, if you wanted your skin to look like the finest ivory, glowing with an almost spectral pallor, you needed something far more effective. And so, with a quiet, eerie elegance, the powdered white lead known as Venetian ceruse was born. Picture it. There you are, sitting in a dimly lit room, the smell of vinegar and metal lingering in the air as a courtly servant grinds a mixture of lead and vinegar into a fine, smooth powder. There is no hesitation, no second thought. The powder will turn your skin into the porcelain perfection you desire. And in an age where beauty was tied to power, purity, and status, what was a little poison when the reward was so great? This was the secret behind that coveted, flawless complexion, one that many noble men and women alike strive for. To achieve this radiant glow, white lead was mixed with vinegar to create a substance that would, once applied to the skin, create a gleaming, matte finish. It was a pale glow so intense, so opaque, that it was said to rival the moonlight. The result was an appearance of delicacy, of fragility, a look that screamed, "I am of the elite. I am untouchable and pure." But there was something insidious lurking behind that beauty, a subtle reminder that perfection always has a price. For while these noble men and women applied their white lead with the same care and attention they would use to tend to their gardens of roses, they were unknowingly flirting with death. The lead powder, when applied daily, seeped into the skin, poisoning the body from within. Little by little, it began its quiet work, eroding not just the appearance of health, but actual health itself. Imagine, if you will, the pain of a slow, creeping sickness. The skin, once so smooth and flawless, begins to darken and blister, peeling away like the layers of an overripe fruit. The gentle glow that once graced the cheeks turns to a sickly pallor as the body begins to show signs of poisoning. Yet, the pursuit of beauty, the allure of delicate, untouchable skin, carried on. For some, this was simply the price to pay for a life spent in luxury, where their faces would be admired, not for their youth or health, but for the noble purity that pale skin symbolized. These were not small, insignificant risks either. The effects of prolonged lead exposure were debilitating, painful, and, more often than not, fatal. Lead poisoning manifested in symptoms that were not unlike a gradual unraveling of one's health: headaches, fatigue, memory loss, and eventually, the loss of motor control. At its worst, the poisoning could lead to convulsions, organ failure, and a slow, drawn-out death. Yet, despite these very real dangers, the use of lead cosmetics remained widespread, almost unquestioned, among the nobility. Why? Because beauty, as we've seen time and time again, was a powerful force in medieval society, a force so strong it could blind you to the damage it was causing. In the courts of kings and queens, where the most elaborate banquets were held and the grandest celebrations took place, beauty was the language of power. The rich and noble didn't just look beautiful, they were beautiful. And that beauty was not just for themselves, it was for everyone around them. It was a declaration, an unspoken message that their beauty was so rare, so perfect, that it could only be preserved through rituals like applying toxic, lead-based powders. Their faces, so pale they could practically glow in the dark, were as much about performance as they were about aesthetics. They were living works of art, their beauty a reflection of their elevated status, the very antithesis of the toil and grime of the peasantry. Now, I'm sure you're wondering, how did this beauty ideal become so ingrained? How did these toxic powders come to be seen as symbols of grace and sophistication, despite the obvious health risks? Well, The answer lies in the social fabric of the time. The aristocracy held the power, and they decided what was beautiful. They could afford to sacrifice their health for the sake of vanity, while the common folk had no such luxury. It was a game of appearance over reality. The noble class set the rules of the beauty game, and the rest of society, in their desperation to climb the social ladder, would imitate these trends, even at their own peril. But let's take a moment to think about the materials involved in this deadly pursuit of perfection. The process of preparing this white lead powder was both an art and a science of its own. First, lead was carefully corroded using vinegar, a common household item, until it formed a white, powdery substance. This powder, once ground to a fine dust, could be applied directly to the skin, creating that unmistakable pallor that signified high status. The fact that the powder was toxic wasn't really part of the conversation, it was just how things were done. No one at the time had the benefit of our modern understanding of chemistry or medicine. If it worked, it was good, and if it didn't, well, that was the price of beauty. What's truly fascinating, though, is how the medieval aristocracy embraced these side effects. There was no shame in the blisters that formed on their skin, the peeling that would eventually follow, or the illnesses that came with prolonged use of the cosmetics. In fact, these were often seen as signs of beauty's success. The fact that you could endure the discomforts of using such harsh cosmetics was, in itself, a symbol of your ability to withstand discomfort for the sake of looking perfect. It wasn't just about the exterior, it was about a commitment to the ideal. You could see this dedication in everything, from the hours spent applying the powder to the layers of protective clothing that shielded the skin from the sun, to the medical treatments that would eventually be sought when the effects of lead poisoning began to manifest. But despite all this suffering, the use of lead makeup endured as the ultimate beauty standard. Why? Because, as history has shown us time and time again, the pursuit of beauty is rarely about health or logic. It's about symbols. It's about power. It's about making a statement to the world that says, I am above the struggles of daily life. I am untouchable, unspoiled, and perfect in my fragility. The lead powder was, in essence, a badge of nobility. It said, I have the luxury of being impervious to the common concerns of the world. While the peasants labored in the fields, sweating under the sun, the aristocracy remained indoors, carefully applying their toxic makeup to retain their image of purity, beauty, and social supremacy. And as much as this practice may seem absurd to us today, it made perfect sense in a world where outward appearances were everything, where beauty wasn't just admired, it was envied. The irony of it all, of course, is that the very thing that made these people appear flawless, their white lead skin, was also slowly eating away at their health. It was a hidden poison, one that could not be seen by those who admired their beauty from afar. And yet, in some way, the fact that it was dangerous only seemed to enhance the allure. To be beautiful in the Middle Ages wasn't just about looking good, it was about suffering for it. The more effort you put in, the more toxic the process, the more valuable you were perceived to be. In a sense, the aristocracy wore their pain as a mark of pride. But no matter how much they might have tried to convince themselves that the price was worth it, eventually the side effects could no longer be ignored. As time went on, the more obvious signs of lead poisoning began to appear, and the nobility had to face the consequences of their beauty ideals. Yet, the obsession with pale skin did not fade with the realization of its dangers. The pursuit of perfection, after all, is a powerful force, one that is not easily quelled by mere facts or logic. Instead, as with many trends of the past, the ideals of beauty shifted, adapted, and took on new forms, often with the same dangers lurking beneath. So, my dear friends, as we continue to journey through the strange, twisted world of medieval beauty, let's take a deep breath and reflect on what we've learned thus far. Perfection in the medieval world came with a steep cost. Lead-based makeup was not just a beauty trend, it was a symbol of power, of privilege, and ultimately of fragility. As we walk forward into the next chapter of our exploration, let us keep in mind that the pursuit of beauty, however misguided, is a tale as old as time, one that continues to weave its way through history, often leaving a trail of both brilliance and destruction. And as always, the price of perfection is rarely as simple as we might hope. Ah, dear traveler, I hope you're still with me as we continue our journey deeper into the enchanting yet often bewildering world of medieval beauty. We've already seen the pursuit of pale skin, the dedication to looking fragile, and the lengths people would go to, even if it meant poisoning themselves with lead, all in the name of perfection. But our journey doesn't stop there. No, tonight we venture further into the realm of aesthetics, a place where beauty standards were not only about skin, but about the very shaped times of the face. And let me tell you, the face in the medieval world was not just a canvas, it was a statement, the ultimate symbol of intellect, divinity, and nobility was found in a peculiar yet highly sought-after feature, the high forehead. Yes, my friend, forget the low, soft, natural contours of modern-day beauty standards. In the Middle Ages, the times taller asterisk, the times smoother asterisk, and the times more unbroken times your forehead, the closer you were to divine perfection. Now, if you think this sounds a bit, well, bizarre asterisk, you're not alone. The high forehead was the very essence of ideal beauty for the aristocracy, a look so revered that achieving it became a matter of life or, quite possibly, death, but we'll get to that in a moment. The ideal face was no longer about round cheeks or soft jawlines. Oh no, my dear. In the medieval world, it was about the elegance of a wide, unbroken expanse of skin above your brow. This endless forehead, as it was sometimes called, symbolized purity, grace, and a kind of intellectual superiority that only the elite were thought to possess. And here's the kicker, getting that look wasn't as simple as just being born with a lofty brow. No. To truly achieve the aesthetic of time's refined intelligence, time's divine beauty, noble women, and sometimes men, but mostly women, had to resort to methods so extreme, so painful, that they might make you think twice before ever picking up a tweezer again. Picture this, a noble woman sitting before her vanity, the golden glow of candlelight flickering across the room. There she is, with her back straight, posture as poised as a queen, preparing herself for the time's ritual asterisk, not of applying makeup, mind you, but of time's removing times. To achieve that ideal forehead, a noblewoman had to pluck her eyebrows away entirely. Yes, you read that right. Pluck. Her eyebrows. Every last hair had to go, leaving behind a smooth, flawless canvas of skin above her eyes. But that was just the beginning, dear traveler. If you wanted to go above and beyond, as one surely would in such a time of indulgence, you didn't just stop with the eyebrows. Oh no. Some women even shaved back their hairlines, inch by inch, to extend their foreheads to the heavens. Imagine the painstaking hours spent removing the tiniest hairs from the scalp with nothing more than tweezers, scissors, or if you were feeling particularly adventurous times, caustic creams, asterisk. Yes, I said caustic creams, which were often made from things like quicklime or even the juice of vinegar-soaked leeches. Though I'd recommend skipping that last one, unless you really times love, times the smell of vinegar. and perhaps a little bit of danger. In the world of the medieval court, where appearances meant everything, no expense was spared to achieve perfection. And if that meant burning your scalp with harsh chemicals, so be it. The result, once all was said and done, was in time's unbroken asterisk, towering forehead, a forehead so majestic, so uninterrupted, that one might think it belonged to an ethereal being. Floating above the mortal realm, women would gaze at themselves in the mirror with satisfaction, the smoothness of their skin so divine that it almost seemed otherworldly. The high forehead became a symbol of beauty, of divinity, of time, something beyond mere mortal's asterisk. It said, "I am not just noble, I am blessed. I am above it all, intellectually and spiritually." But achieving this high forehead wasn't a solitary pursuit. Oh no. The forehead in all its glory needed an equally divine accessory to emphasize its majesty. And so the wimple was born. What is a wimple, you ask? Imagine a tight-fitting cloth that covered the head, often drawing attention to the forehead, its sharp lines elevating the noblewoman's already prominent features. The wimple was part of a larger ensemble of headgear that became synonymous with medieval beauty accessories like the hennin, the tall conical hat that could reach up to a foot high, or even more, as it towered above the wearer like a crown, though not quite as time's comfortable asterisk. These were the fashion accessories that emphasized the high forehead, helping it stand out even more, while concealing the fact that the noblewoman's scalp had been shaved or plucked to within an inch of its life. And let's not forget the impact of art on these beauty ideals. It was not just the women of the time who knew that a lofty forehead was the ultimate symbol of beauty. It was also the artists. As in all things, art was a mirror of society. And so portraits of noble women often depicted them with impossibly high foreheads and delicate features, reflecting the ideals of the day. In these portraits, the women looked serene, untouchable, as though they were gods, or at the very least, angelic beings walking among mere mortals. Their smooth, high foreheads were as constant as the stars in the night sky, praised in poetry and literature as the epitome of elegance. In fact, artists would often exaggerate the size of the forehead to emphasize the beauty of the face, almost as if they were painting a figure who could not possibly exist in the real world. Such was the reverence for the high forehead in medieval society. Now, let's take a moment to pause and reflect on this strange and wonderful pursuit of beauty. Can you imagine the lengths one would go to in order to achieve such a look? The hours spent plucking, shaving, and applying caustic creams to one's skin, all for the sake of a beauty ideal that emphasized intellectual and divine superiority. What was it all for, really? A look? A status symbol? Or perhaps a longing for something more, an attempt to reach for the heavens, to connect with something higher than oneself? The more I think about it, the more it feels like a kind of quest for immortality. To achieve the perfect high forehead and to look times divine times in every sense of the word it was, perhaps the only way to ensure you were remembered by posterity, immortalized in the annals of beauty history. But, of course, there were those who couldn't afford such extravagant beauty regimens. For the peasant women, the women who worked under the scorching sun, their foreheads would never be high times enough to please the courts. Their brows, too, would remain intact, their faces marked by the roughness of their labor. And yet, in this stark contrast, the high forehead of the noblewoman became even more of a symbol of exclusion, of that invisible line that separated the rich from the poor, the elegant from the common. And so, as we continue to float through the halls of history, I ask you to think about these beauty ideals. The high forehead was not just a matter of personal preference. It was a marker of class, of intellectual and divine superiority. It was a look that required sacrifice, discomfort, and a willingness to go to extremes, all in the name of beauty. And of course, it didn't end there. The journey of medieval beauty was far more than the forehead alone. There were eyebrows to be plucked, faces to be painted, and an entire world of ideals to be chased. But for now, let's linger a bit longer on that tall, smooth forehead, one that could not help but shine with the light of the divine, a beacon of beauty, intellect, and social standing in an ever-hungry world of appearances. As we move on from this world of high foreheads and vanishing eyebrows, I hope you'll take with you the realization that beauty, in all its forms, is a complex dance between desire, class, and power. It isn't just about looking pretty, it's about showing the world who you are, or at least who you want them to think you are. And for the noble women of the Middle Ages, it was a dance that required not only the perfect features, but the willingness to sacrifice anything: your time, your health, and of course, your very own natural beauty. Ah, my dear wanderer, how we've journeyed thus far through the peculiar and sometimes perilous world of medieval beauty. Pale skin, high foreheads, and delicate features, each ideal more bizarre than the last. But our adventure has one final stop before we drift into the safety of the night. If you thought the removal of eyebrows was just a passing fad, an oddity of historical vanity, then let me tell you, you're about to enter a world that makes the previous beauty standards look positively tame. Yes, let's take a moment to discuss the times war times on eyebrows. I can hear your gasps from here, dear reader, but trust me, what lies ahead is a chapter of beauty history that rivals even the most daring feats of medieval self-deception. It is, without a doubt, one of the most eyebrow-raising, pun-intended fashion trends in medieval times. Imagine, if you will, stepping into a candlelit room, the faint, sweet scent of incense lingering in the air. You are surrounded by noble women, their foreheads gleaming in the soft glow of the firelight, their complexions as smooth and pale as alabaster. But there's something even more striking about these women. As your eyes travel down their perfectly smooth, unbroken foreheads, you come to a peculiar realization. Asterisk. Where have their eyebrows gone? Asterisk. Oh yes, indeed. The times eyebrows, times those humble little features that frame the face, giving expression and emotion. In the medieval world, these tiny, often overlooked hairs became the symbol of something much more profound. They weren't just a small detail in the grand scheme of the face, they were the time's enemy asterisk. The idea of a beautiful, refined face in the medieval period didn't include eyebrows at all. Instead, to fit the standards of beauty that ruled the courts of Europe, the ideal woman, and occasionally man, had a smooth, asterisk bare times forehead, unbroken by the inconvenient presence of natural brows. And how, you ask, did these fine individuals achieve such a look? Well, my friend, it wasn't achieved with a gentle eyebrow pencil or a dab of eyebrow gel. Oh no, these were serious, ancient times methods so extreme that you might wonder whether the pursuit of beauty had, at times, slipped into the realm of madness. The process involved nothing short of the total removal of one's eyebrows, leaving behind a blank canvas of skin above the eyes. To some, this might seem like a step too far, but to the medieval nobility, it was the epitome of beauty, a look that promised times, purity, asterisk, asterisk elegance, asterisk, and even in times angelic times appearance. At this point, you might be thinking, surely such a drastic transformation must have come with a catch, right? And you would be absolutely correct. This wasn't some casual beauty routine, it was a full-on times war asterisk. To achieve this refined look, Women, and sometimes men, resorted to incredibly dangerous, often painful methods to rid themselves of their eyebrows. The tools of the trade, well, let's just say they weren't exactly safe for modern use. First, there was the most common method, asterisk tweezing asterisk. Yes, the noble women of the time would endure long hours, meticulously plucking away every single eyebrow hair. But what happens when plucking alone doesn't seem enough to create the perfect, smooth forehead? That's when things took a more, shall we say, asterisk, adventurous times turn. For those who truly wanted to achieve that otherworldly, angelic look, the next step was to use a far more extreme and dangerous technique. Asterisk chemical depilatories, asterisk. Enter arsenic, quicklime, and vinegar. Three ingredients so toxic, they sound like the contents of a medieval alchemist's worst nightmare. Quicklime, a substance made from heating limestone, was notorious for its caustic nature. When applied to the skin, it could burn, blister, and even cause severe chemical burns. And yet, this was the price one paid for beauty in the medieval period. Quicklime, mixed with vinegar, could supposedly remove hair, but the risk was enormous, as the acid would often eat away not just at the hair, but at the very skin itself. Women who used these depilatories were well aware of the potential for pain and scarring. But as always, beauty came at a cost. In addition to quicklime, arsenic was sometimes used as a depilatory, a substance so deadly that it has been banned in modern cosmetics for centuries. Yet, back then, arsenic was believed to have magical properties. If it could cause the hair to vanish, surely it must have some hidden, otherworldly power. The tragic irony is that while these treatments promised the smooth, flawless foreheads of the gods, they often left the user with blisters, scarring, and infections. Some unlucky souls found themselves enduring the slow, painful onset of arsenic poisoning, with symptoms that ranged from nausea and fatigue to organ failure and death. But still, the fashion persisted. What was a little pain and suffering when the reward was such beauty? I can almost hear you asking, why then did these methods endure? Well, my friend, the answer lies in the powerful desire to times belong asterisk. In a society where status was everything, where the nobles and the royals set the tone for what was considered beautiful and pure, to follow the trend was to ensure your place within the aristocracy. It wasn't just about looking good. It was about proving you were of higher times status, higher intellect, and, of course, closer to divine perfection. The removal of the eyebrows became a visual shorthand for purity, for otherworldliness. No longer burdened by those pesky little hairs, the forehead appeared higher, smoother, more refined, just like that of a saint or an angel in religious paintings. And who, in a world so steeped in religion, didn't want to look like they had been touched by the hand of God? This ideal of the perfect, bare forehead was reinforced through art and literature. Artists of the time would frequently portray noble women and even goddesses with high, smooth foreheads, their brows either barely visible or absent altogether. Literature and poetry, too, glorified this look, praising women who were as pure and untouched as the saints themselves. Endless foreheads, they were often called, an aesthetic so pure that it seemed to stretch beyond the realm of mere mortals. Yet, not everyone was willing to part with their eyebrows entirely. In some regions of medieval Europe, the trend wasn't quite as extreme. There were pockets of society where light eyebrows, gently arched, or even slightly defined, were still considered acceptable. Perhaps these were places where fashion had yet to reach its fever pitch, or perhaps they were simply more sensible, though I must admit, they were far less likely to end up with scarring, or worse, poisoning. In these places, women would sometimes only times pluck their eyebrows, removing a few stray hairs to create a softer, more natural look. The ideal forehead, still smooth and high, was attained without the danger of harsh chemicals or excessive hair removal. But alas, these lighter styles were the exception, not the rule. By and large, the medieval world was obsessed with perfection, and that meant adopting extreme methods to achieve that flawless, high forehead, free from the burden of eyebrows. Whether plucked, shaved, or chemically removed, the pursuit of that endless, angelic forehead was relentless. It was a beauty ideal that had little to do with the actual face in front of you, and everything to do with the times of purity, grace, and nobility. And so, dear traveler, we find ourselves at the crossroads of the strange and the beautiful once again. The war on eyebrows, a battle fought with tweezers, caustic creams, and poisons, was only one of many strange quests for beauty in the medieval period. But as we leave this curious chapter behind, let us remember that beauty, at least in the medieval world, was never about what was natural. It was always about what could be shaped, altered, and, if need be, sacrificed for the sake of an ideal. With the removal of eyebrows came a smooth, bare canvas, a symbol of purity and intellect, a reflection of the heavenly beings the nobles wished to emulate. The times may have been angelic, but the methods were not. Yet, in the eyes of medieval society, the price was worth it. The face, free of eyebrows and unbroken, could finally be called time's divine asterisk. And as we step into the next chapter of our exploration, let us continue to reflect on the lengths people will go to, sometimes even at the expense of their own well-being, just to belong to the ideal. For in the end, that's what beauty has always been, a reflection of our greatest desires, our deepest longings, and sometimes our most dangerous impulses. Ah, dear friend, you've been so patient, and I do hope the quiet hum of the medieval world continues to lull you into a peaceful sense of wonder. But don't relax too much, for our journey is not yet finished. We've explored the heights of the high forehead and the tragic war on eyebrows. We've ventured through the dangerous world of pale skin and poisonous lead, and now we find ourselves in the intoxicating realm of rouge, blush, and the ever-present danger of vanity. Yes, you heard that correctly. We now turn our attention to the little bit of color that managed to make its way onto the cheeks of medieval beauties: rouge. The rosy flush that today is synonymous with youth and vitality was not only a mark of beauty in the Middle Ages, but also a symbol of something more, a dangerous pursuit, a tantalizing touch of life in a world where excess could be both a privilege and a sin. So, sit back, dim those lights just a little more, and let us drift into the world of color red, vibrant, and all too often deadly. Now, when you think of blush, what do you imagine? A soft, delicate sweep of color across the cheekbones? A subtle glow that radiates health and youth? Ah, yes. That's the modern look, isn't it? But in the medieval world, the subtle flush of color wasn't just about looking fresh-faced or alive, it was a statement. A time's symbol, times of vitality, fertility, and even, yes, a certain amount of grace. In an era where appearance was the clearest marker of social rank, health, and virtue, the cheeks were often the first place where one could display their status, whether it be through natural means or more often than not through artifice. In a society obsessed with the outer signs of life, youth, and divine favor, a rosy cheek was more than just a sign that you'd enjoyed a stroll in the garden or a hearty meal. No, my friend, it was a declaration that you were youthful, fertile, And in the prime of your life, no signs of sickness, no dullness from labor, and certainly no evidence of the graying and hardening effects of age. It was a delicate balance, because in medieval times, a flush of color on the cheek didn't just symbolize health, it symbolized wealth and purity. But here's where the fun begins. To get that perfect glow, medieval women, and some men, but mostly women, had to turn to all manner of things: natural dyes, berries, and even crushed insects. Yes, you heard that right. The same lovely beetroot that we know today for adding a bit of sweetness to our salads or juices was once used in the pursuit of beauty, squeezed into a deep red paste, then carefully applied to the cheeks to bring them to life. But it didn't stop there, oh no. They also turned to crushed strawberries, mulberries, and even times cochineal asterisk, a tiny red insect that, when crushed, could produce a brilliant scarlet pigment. There's something undeniably charming about the medieval ingenuity of turning things like Time's bugs into beauty products, isn't there? One can't help but imagine a medieval courtier gazing into a mirror, applying the blood-red paste of tiny creatures to their cheeks, while not entirely thinking about the times, how times, or times why asterisk. After all, beauty, much like today, had no room for hesitation. And yet, for all of their creativity, these natural remedies, though readily available, had one small, fatal flaw. They simply didn't last. The color would fade too quickly, requiring constant touch-ups. But in the world of the medieval elite, where status and refinement could be boiled down to how you presented yourself, how you appeared, there was no room for imperfection. So, in a brilliant act of both desperation and decadence, women, and occasionally men, though more rarely, began to turn to the dark side time's toxic pigments asterisk. Yes, the noble women who walked the courts in their richest gowns and finest jewels didn't just settle for simple berries. No, they were willing to take it a step further. They began to apply cinnabar and red lead to their cheeks, two pigments that would make any modern makeup artist's stomach turn. These pigments were rich, vibrant, and long-lasting, sure, but they were also deadly. Cinnabar, a bright red mineral, was often used in a variety of ways, including as a pigment for rouge, while red lead, another deeply toxic substance, was frequently employed in both cosmetics and art. These rich, jewel-toned pigments gave the cheeks a glow that was, well, asterisk, undeniably times divine, but it was a glow that came with a hefty price tag. Ingesting or absorbing even small amounts of these pigments could cause irreversible damage, from nausea and fatigue to hair loss, and ultimately, death. Yet, for the medieval aristocrat, the allure of immortality, through beauty of radiance that would last forever in the paintings of court artists, was too tempting to resist. Imagine, then, a woman of the court, resplendent in her finest velvet gown, a perfect flush on her cheeks as she steps into the ballroom. Her red lips, flushed cheeks, and smooth porcelain skin are the epitome of grace and purity. Yet, behind that carefully curated beauty, there lies the risk, the rouge, the blush, the deep red pigments. Each layer of color that adorns her face may very well be a poison, a silent killer. And the worst part? She knows it, but she doesn't care. After all, beauty comes at a cost. But this wasn't just a personal choice. Oh no. The pressure to be beautiful, to be perfect, to embody the ideal of youth and vitality wasn't merely an individual pursuit. It was a societal one. For the wealthy, beauty was power. It was a symbol of their elevated social standing, a mark of refinement, and, more than anything, a display of their time's purity asterisk. They didn't have to work. They didn't have to toil in the fields. and they certainly didn't have to deal with the everyday messes of life. To be wealthy was to be untouched by the ugly, the hard, the raw aspects of human existence. A perfect cheek, glowing with blush, wasn't just a symbol of life. It was a symbol of times a life that never touched the dirt of the common folk asterisk. But here's the truly maddening part. This obsessive pursuit of perfection was not, in fact, the domain of the peasant class. No, the poor simply didn't have the means to dabble in such things. For them, the rosy cheeks they had were the result of fresh air and hard work, not crushed bugs or toxic minerals. Beauty, in that case, was purely natural, a flush brought on by the toil of the land or the simple joy of living. For the noble women, on the other hand, the beauty they presented was about constructing an ideal, about creating a version of themselves that didn't simply exist, at times had to be made asterisk. As for the church, well, the clergy were none too pleased about this little fashion trend. In fact, they considered the application of makeup, whether it be the toxic pigments of cinnabar or the simpler natural dyes, to be a times sin of vanity asterisk. The church, ever watchful of the souls of its flock, was quick to label any pursuit of beauty beyond what was natural as times prideful asterisk, a sign of moral decay. To adorn oneself with makeup, they argued, was to flaunt one's vanity, to elevate oneself above God's creation. Vanity was considered a sin, and for the church, to highlight one's cheeks with the glow of unnatural hues was a direct insult to the purity they believed each woman should embody. And yet, the very women who were told to avoid such vanity were often the same ones plastering their faces with lead-based rouge and staining their lips with cinnabar. So, the merry dance continued. While the church wagged its finger in disapproval, the aristocracy applied more makeup, more rouge, more color to their cheeks, each stroke of pigment a calculated move in the never-ending game of appearance and power. In a world where the church held moral authority, beauty held the social one, and thus, my dear friend, we find ourselves at a curious crossroads once again. Rouge, blush, and the delicate flush of color were not just about times looking good times in medieval Europe. They were about life, youth, fertility, and, above all, the construction of an identity that was never fully natural but always carefully curated. With a brush and a little bit of poison, the pursuit of beauty in this era was not simply about looking youthful, it was about looking times eternal asterisk, about having a glow that was so divine it could be immortalized in art. As we move further along in our exploration of medieval beauty, let's remember this. While a simple blush might seem like a harmless accent to modern beauty, in the Middle Ages, it was the foundation of a much darker story, a story of vanity, mortality, and the dangerous price of perfection. But fear not, my weary traveler, for we still have much more to uncover about the strange and fascinating world of medieval aesthetics. I do hope you're ready to continue, though I must warn you, the best is yet to come. And so, dear traveler, as we move deeper into the shadowy yet oddly beautiful labyrinth of medieval beauty standards, we find ourselves at the very crown of the head times, the hair asterisk. It is here, at the top of the human form, that ideals of virtue, purity, and even divinity were most visibly displayed. In the Middle Ages, hair wasn't just hair, it was a statement. It was a symbol of holiness, a sign of social standing, and a marker of moral worth. In an age where appearance was often a direct reflection of one's inner sanctity and character, the condition and style of your hair told the world everything it needed to know about who you were. And of all the hair colors that could capture the light of the divine, none was more revered than time's blonde asterisk. Yes, That shimmering golden hue that dances like sunlight on water, the very thing that medieval society held up as the epitome of beauty, purity, and grace. And who, I ask you, could argue with this? In a world where divine beauty was often depicted through religious imagery, it's no surprise that the Virgin Mary, that holiest of figures, was frequently painted with flowing golden locks. Yes, my friend, in the eyes of the medieval world, blonde hair wasn't just a color, it was a time's holy standard asterisk. The light, the radiance, the otherworldly glow of blonde hair, as seen on the Virgin, became the ultimate ideal of beauty. But, as we know, beauty standards are never as simple as they seem. The search for that golden angelic hue wasn't just a matter of having the right genes. Oh, no. Medieval women, and sometimes men, would go to great lengths times to achieve that shimmering holy hair. Imagine, if you will, a young noblewoman sitting at her vanity, carefully mixing together her secret recipe for hair lightening. No, it wasn't some modern hair salon treatment involving fancy chemicals and $50 shampoos. No, this was far more times creative asterisk, if somewhat times questionable asterisk. The ingredients? Well, to start, there was saffron, the golden spice, which, when mixed into a concoction, could turn the hair a lighter shade of blonde. Then there was honey, that sweet nectar of the gods, which, when applied to hair, not only nourished it, but also added a subtle, sun-kissed tint. But that's not all, my dear traveler. To truly achieve that perfect times blonde, some medieval women, and let's be honest, probably a few brave men, used urine times to lighten their hair. The belief was that the ammonia found in urine, when left in hair for long enough, could strip it of its darker tones, leaving behind a lighter, more radiant hue. But let's not get too comfortable yet, because we haven't even mentioned ash times, because, of course, the medieval world had a remedy for everything. A mixture of ash, carefully mixed into a paste, was thought to do wonders for those looking to achieve a bright blonde shine. Imagine, if you will, carefully applying this ash-based concoction to your hair and then sitting in the sun, waiting for it to work its magic, your hair slowly transforming into the color of wheat fields and holy icons. While today, we might think of such methods as little more than bizarre medieval quackery, back then, the pursuit of that golden glow was a serious business, one worth every ounce of effort, no matter how uncomfortable or downright odd the methods might seem. But let's pause for a moment, dear traveler, and consider what all of this tells us about the medieval world. To have blonde hair wasn't just to possess a color, it was to possess times something more asterisk. Blonde hair signified an elevated status, one tied deeply to virtue, holiness, and, in many ways, the very ideals of the time's divine asterisk. After all, as the Virgin Mary was often portrayed with blonde tresses, it was easy to see why blonde hair would be equated with purity, virtue, and grace. To wear it was to be seen as time's chosen asterisk, as part of an elevated class, even if that class wasn't always determined by birth. Those with blonde hair were believed to be closer to the divine, touched by the gods themselves. What a heavy crown to wear, my friend. Yet a crown that many noble women, in particular, were willing to don. The ideal of blonde hair, however, was not just about the color. It was also about how the hair was worn. In a world where modesty was the highest virtue, and women were expected to keep their purity intact, the way in which one wore their hair was of time's great importance asterisk. For unmarried women, the golden ideal meant long, loose, flowing hair, a look that symbolized innocence, youth, and, of course, virginity. Unmarried women could wear their hair long, cascading down their backs like the endless waves of a golden sea. Hair, in this sense, became not only a symbol of beauty, but of moral standing. It was a symbol of a woman who had yet to be tainted by the world, whose beauty was pure and untouchable, like that of a saint or an angel. And then, of course, there were the married women. A very different story altogether. For once a woman married, her golden crown, her long flowing hair, was no longer a symbol of her youth or purity. No, now it became something to be hidden, tucked away, and covered. In fact, once married, a woman's hair became a sign of her times, moral times, and times social times, duty times, a duty to her husband, her family, and her station in life asterisk. Married women were expected to conceal their hair beneath veils, wimples, and other head coverings. Hair that had once flowed freely in its golden glory was now bound, restricted, and hidden from the view of the public. This wasn't just about modesty, it was about time's ownership asterisk. The long, free-flowing locks that had signified virginity now signified time's responsibility asterisk. The change in hairstyle was a visual representation of a woman's transition from youthful freedom to the binding, unspoken contract of marriage. Ah, but there was another layer to this delicate dance of hair and identity. Married women who wore their hair concealed still needed to maintain the time's ideal asterisk. A well-maintained, well-groomed head of hair, whether concealed or displayed, was a sign of a woman's status. The richer the woman, the finer the cloth she used to cover her hair, the more intricate the veil, the more expensive the wimple. It was, in many ways, the medieval version of a social badge, a marker of wealth and position in society. The nobility, the wealthy, the highborn, these were the women who could afford the time, the care, and the fine materials required to maintain the time's ideal asterisk. The common folk, on the other hand, were more likely to be seen with their hair untamed, unadorned, and certainly less restricted. For them, beauty wasn't something you could conceal. It was something you lived in. Still, even within the noble class, there was a certain tension. While blonde hair was the ultimate ideal, not everyone could achieve it naturally, and not everyone had the resources to undergo the lengthy, often painful, and occasionally hazardous hair lightening processes that were so popular. And so, there arose a subtle game of time's presentation asterisk, of time's illusion asterisk. Women with darker hair would sometimes use these hair lightening recipes, not to achieve blonde locks outright, but to enhance the lightness of their hair, to give it a golden gleam that would pass for the real thing. The goal wasn't necessarily to be blonde in the strictest sense, but to have time's hair that times looked times blonde enough to be recognized as divine. And thus, in this world of long, flowing locks and carefully hidden tresses, we begin to see the true complexity of beauty in the Middle Ages. The hair was not just hair, it was in time's ideal asterisk, a symbol of purity, youth, and holiness. It was an outward manifestation of a woman's moral and social standing. Blonde hair, in particular, held immense symbolic weight, associated not only with beauty, but with divine grace. To wear it was to wear a crown of holiness, and to hide it, well, was to wear a crown of responsibility. As we continue to ponder the strange and fascinating beauty ideals of the medieval world, let us reflect on the lengths to which people went to attain these symbols of purity and virtue. Whether it was the hair-lightening recipes that involved saffron, honey, urine, or the careful maintenance of social expectations through the concealment of one's hair, the pursuit of beauty in medieval times was never as simple as it appeared. And as you settle in for the night, perhaps you'll find yourself wondering, how much has really changed? The ideals may have shifted, but the pursuit of beauty, my dear traveler, is as old as time itself. Now, with hair ideals behind us, we turn our gaze to another fascinating aspect of medieval beauty, the concept of the perfect times body asterisk, where the lines between fragility and strength blur, and the ideal becomes yet another fantastical creation. But that, my friend, is a tale for another time. Let us rest for now and reflect on the golden ideals of hair, purity, and divine beauty that have so often shaped our past. As we continue our meandering journey through the tapestry of medieval beauty standards, we now find ourselves at the crossroads of modesty and complexity, an area where fashion wasn't just about style, but about societal expectations, religious decrees, and, as you might expect, a little bit of subtle rebellion. If you've been following along, you'll know by now that in medieval times, nothing was ever as simple as it appeared. Beauty was a matter of both appearance times and times behavior, both a visual representation and a moral statement. Nowhere was this more evident than in the ever-present veil, the ubiquitous wimple, and the intricate web of head coverings that became the ultimate symbol of modesty for married women. And it's here that we uncover not just the story of fashion, but the story of control of how women's appearances were shaped not only by their desire to fit into society, but by the ever-watchful eye of religion and social expectation. Let us step into the medieval world once again, shall we? Picture this. A noblewoman, dressed in her finest gown, steps into the bustling courtyard of a grand estate. Her attire is nothing short of magnificent. Her gown of rich velvet, her jewelry sparkling like the stars in the sky. But wait, what's that? On her head, she wears a veil, a thick, often multi-layered veil that conceals most of her hair, leaving only a small portion of her face visible. Now, you may wonder, why the veil? Surely such beauty needs no covering. But in the medieval world, the veil was not merely a fashion choice. It was a time's necessity asterisk. For married women, the veil was the ultimate time's symbol of modesty. To leave the house without it, to allow one's hair to be visible to the world, was considered improper, even time's sinful asterisk. The Church, ever vigilant in its guardianship of virtue, decreed that a woman's hair, once it had been claimed by marriage, was no longer for public view. The long, flowing locks that had once been a symbol of youth and purity were now a time's possession, time's something to be kept hidden under layers of cloth. A married woman, after all, was no longer a free agent, and her hair, as much as her body, belonged to her husband. The veil, the wimple, and the intricate head coverings that followed were not just about modesty, they were a direct reflection of her role within society. Asterisk wife, mother, and keeper of virtue asterisk. But here's where the story gets even more interesting, because if medieval beauty was about one thing, it was about time's layers asterisk. And I'm not just talking about the metaphorical layers of social expectation and religious morality. No, my friend, I'm talking about the literal layers of cloth that adorned the heads of women in the Middle Ages. To cover one's hair wasn't just a matter of throwing on a simple shawl. Oh no, it was a complex times affair. Women in the medieval period wore not one, not two, but a variety of head coverings. The coif, a small, tight-fitting cap, was often the first layer. It was the humble foundation, a snug little hat designed to cover the hair and keep it neatly in place. Over that would go a veil, a thin, delicate piece of cloth that would drape gracefully down, often covering the shoulders and neck, leaving only the face exposed. And here we see the real depth of the situation. Because the more times wealthy times and times noble times the woman, the more elaborate her head coverings. The veil wasn't just a practical necessity. It became a time status symbol asterisk. Nobility could afford layers upon layers of fine cloth, silk, and even intricate jeweled headdresses that would be placed over the veil, as if to say, I am times modest times, but I am also times important asterisk. These headdresses were often adorned with gems, pearls, and gold, reflecting the woman's social status while still adhering to the rigid standards of modesty. It's almost as though society said, we'll cover your head, but we'll do so in a way that makes sure everyone knows just how important times you are. It's a bit like putting a crown on someone's head while telling them they need to wear a hat. And what of those in the times lower times classes, you ask? Were they to suffer under the same restrictions? The answer is a bit more complicated. While all women were expected to cover their hair upon marriage, those of lower rank didn't have the luxury of wearing elaborate jeweled head coverings. For them, modesty was achieved with simpler veils, often made from plain linen or wool. These head coverings were more about necessity than display, a means to keep the hair hidden and preserve one's dignity without the added flourishes of wealth. But no matter your social standing, the message was clear. Married women, no matter who they were or what their wealth, asterisk, were to be covered, asterisk. But even in the world of high-status head coverings, there was room for rebellion. Yes, beneath the layers of cloth, there was a subtle, quiet act of defiance, one that would echo through the halls of medieval castles and courts. Asterisk, the translucent veil, asterisk. This delicate, sheer veil, often made from the finest linen or silk, allowed for a glimpse of the hair beneath. Some women, daring as they wore veils that were just thin enough to reveal a curl or two of their hair. This wasn't a bold act of defiance. Mind you, it was far subtler. The translucent veil didn't expose the whole head of hair. It simply teased it, giving just a hint of what lay underneath. It was a whisper of rebellion, a way for a woman to show the world that while she was obedient to the rules, she still had a small part of herself that times wasn't entirely controlled, asterisk. It's fascinating, isn't it? How something as simple as a veil, a wimple, or a head covering could hold so much weight, both socially and religiously. What we see here, my friend, is a complex interplay between power, control, and appearance. The veil was more than just a physical garment. It was a time symbol, times of a woman's place in society. To be covered was to be seen as virtuous, modest, and pious. It was a way to signal to the world that you were not just a woman of flesh and blood, but a woman who had been chosen for a higher purpose. A woman who had a role to play in the grand scheme of society, no longer simply a free agent, but part of something larger. The church, of course, was the architect of many of these ideals. Their teachings on modesty permeated every aspect of medieval life. The idea that a woman's hair should be hidden, that her body should be concealed, was deeply tied to the religious belief that women's beauty was not something to be flaunted. It was something to be times guarded, times a gift, to be saved for her husband, her family, and her God. To expose one's hair was to expose one's times, unmarried, times self. It was to risk the temptation of sin, the lure of vanity, and the loss of one's soul. Thus, for the pious medieval woman, a veil wasn't just a garment, it was a shield, a divine shield, against the temptations of the world. And yet, beneath it all, there was still room for subtle rebellion. While the veils may have covered their hair, a slight flicker of hair exposed through a delicate, translucent veil could whisper something entirely different. There was power in this quiet act, a power that was rarely spoken but was always felt. Even as society sought to shape women's appearances into something appropriate, these small acts of defiance, these quiet rebellions, showed that a woman's spirit, her very identity, could never be entirely hidden. As we continue our exploration of medieval beauty, let us take a moment to consider how the things we wear, the things we cover times, are so much more than mere fabric. They are signs, symbols, and expressions of our place in the world. In the medieval era, the veil was not just a piece of cloth. It was a marker of virtue, a reflection of piety, and a symbol of ownership and status. Yet, as we've seen, even in the act of covering, there was the opportunity for quiet resistance. And so, my friend, we move on to our next chapter. But let's carry with us the image of the veiled woman, modest, virtuous, and yet perhaps just a little bit daring. Let us remember that in the world of medieval beauty, even the most sacred of garments could carry with them a hidden spark of individuality and defiance. For in the end, while beauty may have been bound by rules, the spirit, as always, found ways to slip free, if only for a fleeting moment. Next, we venture into the world of medieval figures and bodies, where the line between fragility and strength was finely drawn. And, as always, my dear traveler, the story continues to unfold, layer by layer. Ah, dear friend, as we drift further into the depths of medieval beauty, we come to a truly elevated time subject, one that stands above the rest, quite literally, for we now arrive at one of the most iconic and at times downright absurd accessories of the medieval aristocracy, the hennin. Yes, that towering conical headpiece that looked like a spire from a cathedral or a distant castle turret. If you've ever wondered how medieval women managed to make their fashion statements, both times imposing times and times ridiculous times at the same time, the hennin is your answer. Let's take a stroll through this world where fashion wasn't just about what you wore, but about how high you could go, how large you could loom in a room, and most importantly, how much wealth you could flaunt by balancing a piece of headgear that made times absolutely no sense whatsoever. Picture this. It's the 15th century, and you're attending a grand ball at the court of a noble lord. The air is thick with perfume and the sound of lutes strumming faintly in the background. The chandeliers gleam above, casting soft light on a sea of velvet, satin, and brocade. But, my friend, it's not the gowns you notice first, it's the hats. The women, each more splendid than the last, wear times hennins, times cone-shaped structures towering from their heads, reaching heights of over 2 feet in some cases. These weren't just simple accessories, mind you. Oh no. The hennin was a times status symbol asterisk. The taller the hat, the higher the rank. To wear a hennin wasn't just a fashion statement, it was a statement of times prestige asterisk, of times power asterisk, of nobility. Now, you may ask, why on earth would anyone want to wear a hat that looks like a hatched rocket ready to launch? It's a fair question, I'll admit, but in the medieval world, bigger was always better. And as with many aspects of medieval society, fashion was no exception to this rule. Nobility didn't just want to times look times wealthy. They wanted to times appear elevated times, literally and figuratively. The hennin, with its towering cone-like shape, allowed noble women to quite literally stand head and shoulders above the rest of society. And what better way to show off one's high social standing than to sport a headpiece that could double as an obstacle to doorways? The materials used to create these towering feats of fashion were nothing short of luxurious. Silk, velvet, brocade, these were the fabrics of the elite, the fabrics that were reserved only for those who could afford them. And these weren't just thrown together haphazardly. Oh no, the construction of a hennin required careful craftsmanship. The finest fabrics were shaped, pleated, and sewn together, often with intricate designs that could take days, if not weeks, to complete. The height of the hennin was key. Not only did it show off the wearer's wealth, but it also symbolized her time's elevated, time's position in the social order. The taller the hennin, the greater the prestige. Some women, those with the wealth and means to do so, would even add additional layers of fabric to the cone, creating a veritable mountain of cloth perched atop their heads. It was fashion as spectacle, an embodiment of social climbing made literal. But of course, fashion being fashion, wasn't without its sacrifices. And the hennin? Well, it was a time sacrifice. Times in more ways than one. For one, there was the very practical problem of balance. Wearing a hennin was no small feat. These towering headpieces were made of stiff materials and often adorned with embellishments like veils or sheer fabric that cascaded down, adding to the visual drama. The challenge of walking, dancing, or simply interacting with others while wearing such a structure was enough to make anyone's neck ache just thinking about it. And then, of course, there was the issue of headspace literally. A woman in a hennin would have to duck to pass through doorways, avoid bumping into others, and, let's be honest, probably not make it through a crowded room without knocking something over. But none of that mattered. Because, my dear friend, when it came to medieval nobility, asterisk fashion was the price of admission asterisk. It was a small price to pay for the privilege of being noticed. And speaking of privilege, the hennin wasn't just about style, it was about power. It was a visual declaration that the wearer was part of the elite, the upper crust of society. For the wealthy, it wasn't enough to be rich, you had to be visibly rich. And the hennin served that purpose perfectly. The higher the hat, the more important times you were. There was an unspoken hierarchy in the hennin game. A woman in a tall hennin was immediately recognized as someone of status, someone who could afford the extravagant expense of such a fashion statement. It wasn't just an accessory, it was a time sign of power asterisk, a visual cue that said, I am not just any woman. I am a woman who belongs to the ruling class, who has the right to be seen and admired. Of course, as with all trends, there were critics. The clergy in particular weren't impressed by the hennin. The church, ever concerned with modesty and humility, saw the towering hats as a time's moral offense asterisk. The idea that a woman's beauty, her physical appearance, should be elevated to such extremes was seen as an affront to the divine order. The church's perspective was simple. Modesty was the ideal, and a woman's appearance should reflect her piety, not her vanity. The hennin, with its outlandish height and impractical design, was the very definition of vanity. Clerics scorned these extravagant headpieces, warning that they were a dangerous distraction from the true virtues of humility and devotion. But did that stop the nobility? Of course not. The medieval elite were nothing if not determined to make a statement, and the hennin was too perfect a symbol of that statement to be dismissed. The more the church criticized, the more women adorned their heads with ever taller hennins, reaching for new heights of absurdity. What the clergy saw as excessive vanity, the noblewomen saw as the ultimate expression of power, beauty, and social distinction. And so, the hennin continued its reign, towering ever higher, each one more opulent than the last. And yet, despite the popularity of the hennin, there were moments of subtle rebellion, fleeting moments when a woman, perhaps a bit tired of the towering weight of fashion, would let her veil slip or allow a few stray curls to escape beneath her hennin. It was a delicate defiance, a quiet reminder that beneath all the layers of fabric, the headpieces, the veils, there was still a human being, a woman who wasn't defined solely by her social standing or her fashionable accessories. These small rebellions were whispered acts of individuality in a time when conformity was the rule. a nod to the fact that even in the midst of a tightly controlled society, there were always ways to slip free, if only for a moment. As we stand back and admire the sheer audacity of the hennin, let's reflect on what it says about medieval society. Fashion, in the end, was never just about beauty, it was about time's power asterisk, about making sure the world knew exactly who you were and where you stood. In a world where wealth and status meant everything, a woman's fashion choices were as much about her social rank as they were about her personal taste. The hennin, with its towering cone of fabric, wasn't just a hat, it was a beacon, and Time's announcement times that the wearer was someone to be noticed, someone whose presence demanded attention. And so, as we move from the towering heights of the hennin to the next chapter of our journey, let us remember, medieval beauty was never just about looking good. It was about Time's making a statement asterisk. Every piece of clothing, every accessory, every perfectly plucked eyebrow or delicately painted vein was a carefully constructed message, designed to say, I am Time's here asterisk, and I am someone of importance. Beauty, in the medieval world, was about Time's social position, Time's and Time's morality asterisk, about the delicate balance between appearance and reality. And now, my dear friend, we turn our gaze to the final chapter of our exploration, where we shall uncover the body itself, how it was shaped, adorned, and transformed in the pursuit of beauty. But that, as they say, is a tale for another time. Until then, let the image of the hennin linger in your mind, tall, extravagant, and undeniably unforgettable. The medieval world was a place where beauty was truly Time's elevated, Time's in every sense of the word. As our journey through the labyrinthine world of medieval beauty continues, we now find ourselves at a place where the lines between art, fashion, and society blur into a singular ideal. An ideal not just shaped by fabric and cosmetics, but by the very contours of the body itself. And what better place to begin than the ever-enigmatic concept of the Time's perfect Time's female form. Ah yes, we all know that beauty standards are fluid, shifting with the whims of time, culture, and society. But in the medieval world, the idea of the perfect body wasn't just about physical appearance, it was a representation of Time's spirituality, asterisk, asterisk virtue, asterisk, and Time's noble restraint, asterisk. A woman's body, in the eyes of the medieval elite, was a canvas upon which the virtues of her soul were painted. Imagine, if you will, stepping into the grand hall of a medieval castle. The room is warm, filled with the chatter of nobles and the clinking of goblets. The flicker of candlelight dances upon the walls, and across the room you see her, the ideal woman, a vision of Time's delicate fragility asterisk. Her body is slim, her waist is impossibly narrow, and her movements are slow and graceful, as though every step is an effort to preserve the fragile balance of her form. She is, in every sense of the word, the epitome of what medieval society deemed Time's beautiful asterisk. The Time's spiritually exhausted Time's figure, a body so delicate that it might collapse under the weight of its own virtue. You might think this sounds like a lovely thing, a body of softness and grace, unmarred by the harshness of physical labor or the demands of strength. But in truth, this ideal was not simply about beauty. Oh no, my friend. It was a Time's philosophy asterisk, a Time's way of life asterisk. This figure, this image of a woman, was meant to represent the ideal of restraint, of nobility, of being so far removed from the daily toils of the common folk that she could, quite literally, exist in a fragile state, untouched by the harshness of the world. For, in the medieval view, the ideal woman wasn't just someone with a slim body. She was someone who existed in a delicate, near ethereal state, as if she might swoon at any moment from the sheer weight of her times, spiritual times, and times moral times, purity. Let's start with the most noticeable feature of this ideal, the waist. Ah, yes. The times, narrow waist, times a symbol of refinement, beauty, and, dare I say, divine grace. To have a small waist was not merely to have a small waist. It was to embody the very essence of femininity. Fashion, as it often does, took this ideal and made it even more pronounced, turning what was already a delicate form into something that bordered on times the fragile asterisk. Empire-style dresses, the height of medieval fashion, were designed to exaggerate this fragility by cinching the waist just under the bust. The result? A long, elongated torso that suggested a woman was so physically delicate that a mere breeze could lift her off the ground and carry her away. The wider the hips, the narrower the waist appeared. The dress, with its flowing fabric and high waistline, created an illusion of extreme fragility, amplifying the sense that a woman's body was not meant for physical exertion, but for a life of noble leisure. But let's not mistake this delicate image for a simple fashion trend. Oh no. In the medieval world, the narrow waist was not just a time style, it was in time's ethos asterisk. It was a symbol of the woman who could afford to be delicate, who had no need to toil in the fields, carry heavy buckets, or milk cows. No, this woman's body was a reflection of her status. She was a time's Lady Asterisk, a woman of refinement who had no need for the strength or muscularity that came with manual labor. It was as though strength itself was seen as a mark of times, lower class, times the working class, that had to carry the weight of the world on their broad, capable shoulders. But our ideal woman, with her impossibly narrow waist and soft curves, existed on a higher plane. She was untouched, asterisk, spiritually exhausted times from the pressures of virtue, not from the pressures of physical labor. As we move on from the waist, we turn our gaze to the soft, gentle curves that were to define the ideal female form. You see, in the medieval world, softness was not just about being physically delicate, it was about being spiritually times available, asterisk. The ideal woman was someone who existed in a state of perpetual vulnerability, someone who was meant to be admired, adored, and revered. She wasn't meant to be someone who could times fight times, or at times compete times. She was meant to times inspire asterisk. Her body, with its soft curves, was a reflection of the nurturing, compassionate qualities that medieval society so highly valued. The feminine form was meant to reflect not only beauty, but also the maternal, gentle virtues that were associated with the divine feminine. Yet, despite these ideals of softness and grace, there was also a times necessary, times element of control. The body of the ideal woman was not one of excess, of abundance, or even of health. No, the ideal body was one that suggested restraint because the medieval world prized times moderation, times above all. The ideal female form was one that appeared to be times spiritually drained asterisk, as though the very act of existing in such delicate beauty required constant vigilance. Physical exertion was something that was reserved for men, for the working class, for those who had to toil in the fields to survive. The noble woman, on the other hand, existed in a constant state of times, refinement, times in existence that demanded her body remain untouched by physical activity, as if she were some angelic figure removed from the worldly concerns of strength, stamina, and resilience. But how did she maintain such a fragile, otherworldly figure? The answer, as it often is in matters of medieval beauty, lies in diet and posture. A strict, controlled diet was considered essential to maintaining the time's ideal times body. Women of noble birth, in particular, were expected to eat foods that promoted beauty, not strength. Fatty meats, hearty breads, and rich stews were generally off the menu. Instead, women were encouraged to eat lightly, often consuming foods that would keep them slim and delicate. Fruits, vegetables, and small portions of lean meats were the preferred diet. A woman who was seen to be times too healthy asterisk, too robust, 2 times full-figured times, was considered times less virtuous times, a sign that she might have overindulged, that she might have lost her connection to the noble spiritual restraint that was so highly prized. Posture, too, played a significant role in the cultivation of this ideal body. A woman's posture was an outward reflection of her inner virtue and nobility. Straight, rigid posture was considered a mark of high class. Slouching, on the other hand, was reserved for the lower classes, those whose work required them to bend, stoop, and labor. A noble woman, in contrast, was expected to walk with grace, to hold her back straight, and to maintain a serene and times dignified times presence at all times. She was never to be seen hunching over, bending to pick up anything heavy, or, heaven forbid, exerting herself physically in any way. Her body, though soft and delicate, was to be a model of times-controlled elegance asterisk. She was a vision of restraint, of purity, of time's noble time's existence. But here's where it gets even more fascinating, my friend. In all of this pursuit of fragility and delicate beauty, there was a shadow, an unspoken truth that lingered just below the surface. Because while the ideal woman was soft, small, and times ethereal asterisk, the reality was that many women of the time, noble or not, were not immune to the hardships of life. They may have worn the empire-style dresses, they may have held themselves with perfect posture, but their bodies were not always the perfect, fragile creations that the ideal suggested. In the end, this ideal female form, with its narrow waist, soft curves, and fragile appearance, was a product of a society that prized times, restraint times, and times virtue times above all else. The body was meant to be delicate, to be admired, and to inspire awe. It was a reflection of the social and spiritual expectations placed upon women. Yet, as we know, ideals are rarely realized in full, and behind every meticulously created image of beauty, there lies a human body with its own struggles, its own strength, and its own complexities. As we look beyond the narrow waistlines and soft curves of the ideal, let us remember that beauty is often a times construct, times a carefully curated image designed to reflect a certain vision of society, but not necessarily the reality of the bodies that inhabit it. And so, as you relax into your journey through the past, ponder this. The ideal female body of the Middle Ages may have been delicate, fragile, and ethereal, but it was also, like all ideals, a reflection of a world that sought to control, define, and shape its people, particularly its women. Now, as we continue to explore the strange and fascinating history of beauty standards, let us move beyond the body to the spirit, because, in the end, beauty was never just about the skin or the figure. It was about something deeper, something more elusive, something that, perhaps, we will only begin to uncover in the next chapter of our journey. Ah, the eyes, the window to the soul, as the saying goes. And if we were to take a stroll through medieval beauty standards, we would find that the eyes were far more than just a window. They were times, the times feature that conveyed morality, purity, and spiritual grace. The ideal medieval eye wasn't just a practical tool for seeing the world around you, it was a spiritual instrument, a symbol of divine virtue and emotional depth. But before you picture some serene, doe-eyed maiden gazing out at the world with gentle innocence. Let me paint you a picture of just how much work times went into achieving that angelic, otherworldly gaze. Let's begin by imagining the woman of our time, a noble woman, of course. She's sitting by a flickering candle, her delicate hands weaving through the air as she plays her lute. But it's her eyes that capture attention, large and doe-like, glistening with a soft, almost tearful sheen. You see, in the medieval period, large, tearful times eyes were considered the epitome of feminine beauty. The wider the eyes, the more times innocent times and times pure times you appeared. Those big, shiny eyes were seen as symbols of vulnerability. And more than that, they were thought to hold times soulfulness, times the kind of soulfulness that suggested a deep connection to the divine, as though you were constantly on the verge of fainting from the overwhelming beauty of the world, or perhaps more likely, from the weight of being times too virtuous times for this sinful world. A woman's eyes, particularly if they were large and shimmering with a constant tearful expression, were thought to convey an emotional depth that spoke to her moral character. Think of it, angelic times, eyes, those wide, luminous orbs equated with moral purity, emotional intelligence, and even a faint connection to heaven itself. In the eyes of the medieval world, tears were not just a sign of sadness, they were symbols of compassion, humility, and a deep spiritual connection to the divine. It's as though every tear contained a whispered prayer, a prayer that spoke to the woman's times, innocence, times and times, grace asterisk. A tearful eye, in short, was a times moral times eye, a pure eye, a times saintly times eye. How utterly exhausting, don't you think? But, as is the way of all beauty standards, achieving this look wasn't quite as effortless as simply times being times tearful. Oh no, dear reader, this was about times enhancement asterisk, the kind of enhancement that would give even the most devoted beauty influencers a run for their money. To achieve those times, angelic times, eyes, medieval women, especially those of higher rank, would reach for soot or charcoal. Yes, you heard that right, soot. Not for them the gentle caress of a modern eyeshadow palette or mascara. No, they took their times cosmetics times from the hearth itself. Women would use soot or charcoal, rubbing it carefully around their eyes to make them appear larger and more expressive. The aim? To make their eyes seem even more times vulnerable times, to give the illusion of someone who could cry at any moment, purely because the world was so full of divine sadness. But the beauty of soot, as you might imagine, came at a price. Because as much as soot could enhance the eyes, it also carried with it the risk times of irritation. Imagine, if you will, the delicate process of painting your eyes with soot, the thrill of achieving that tearful gaze, only to have your eyes begin to water not from the emotional weight of the moment, but from the very makeup you'd use to create that effect. Soot and charcoal, while effective, could irritate the skin around the eyes, causing discomfort and even damage in the long run. But what was beauty, if not a little time suffering asterisk? For the medieval woman striving for that perfect, soulful gaze, these risks were part of the process. Just as the pale skin of the time came at the expense of poisoning yourself with lead, so too did achieving those ideal, glistening eyes come with the possibility of irritated eyelids and burning discomfort. But these efforts, these sacrifices, were all for a singular goal: to convey a message to the world. That message was time's emotional depth asterisk. To have large, tearful eyes was to have eyes that expressed time's not just sadness asterisk, but purity, piety, and the burden of emotional sensitivity. A woman's eyes were meant to reflect the weight of her times, moral beauty asterisk, The idea that she was so in touch with her emotions that her eyes times couldn't help times but overflow with unshed tears. This ideal was tied to the notion that women were to be emotionally times available, times soft, gentle, and always on the brink of displaying their empathy for the world. The ideal gaze, it seems, was one that perpetually looked downward. A woman who was spiritually virtuous, according to medieval ideals, was one who didn't times stare times boldly into the world. She times gazed times downwards, soft and demure. Think of the painting you might see in the halls of a cathedral of saints, angels, or the Virgin Mary. Their eyes were always tilted downward, as though gazing humbly at the world below them. There was a deliberate, calculated grace in looking down and acknowledgement that, as a woman, your gaze should never be too direct or too assertive. It was an expression of time's humility, asterisk, an acknowledgement that you were above all a servant to the higher powers, your beauty reflecting a deeper spiritual connection rather than any earthly desire for attention. This downward gaze also conveyed a sense of asterisk, asterisk, vulnerability, asterisk, asterisk, the idea that women were not supposed to be bold, but delicate. After all, you would rarely see a saint staring fiercely at you. Instead, they were seen gazing down, lost in prayer, pure and humble, asterisk. That times was the look the medieval world desired. There was something almost times uncomfortably times fitting about this ideal. The idea that a woman's expression was meant to reflect times not just her beauty times, but her morality. It wasn't about how she felt, it was about how she appeared to times feel asterisk. Beauty, in this sense, was never just skin deep. It was deeply tied to a woman's time spirituality, asterisk, her relationship to God, and her place in society. The idea of the angelic eye was meant to convey more than emotional depth. It was a time symbol, times of purity. The larger the eyes, the more innocent, the more pure the woman was perceived to be. If those eyes were surrounded by soot, well, so be it. The price of beauty was nothing new, after all. But let us not forget that there were, of course, exceptions to these rules. As we've seen time and time again in the medieval world, beauty standards were never times universally times adhered to. While some women may have adhered to the ideal of the tearful downward gaze, others may have rebelled. Some women, perhaps those with a bit more times spirit times or times independence asterisk, might have looked times directly times into the eyes of those around them. After all, there was something distinctly powerful about holding one's gaze steady, even if it was at odds with the ideal of purity. Perhaps in such women, the message was different times, strong times instead of fragile, asterisk, assertive times instead of demure. While the ideal eyes of medieval society were large and tearful, filled with saintly grace, there was room, albeit a small room, for a woman to express something else. Asterisk strength, asterisk. Yet, for the vast majority of medieval women, the ideal was clear. Large, teary eyes were the gateway to purity, to virtue, and to spirituality. These eyes were not just windows to the soul, they were windows to a woman's moral character, her emotional intelligence, and her connection to the divine. They were eyes that times bent, times under the weight of their own beauty. Eyes that looked inward and downward as a sign of their deep inner grace. In the end, medieval beauty standards, perhaps more than any other time period, were all about creating a times persona asterisk, a figure of idealized purity that matched not just the appearance of beauty, but the spiritual essence of the woman herself. Now, as we leave behind the gaze that defined medieval beauty, let's turn our focus to another, often overlooked, yet equally important aspect of the body, the breath. Because, you see, Beauty was never just about the eyes, or the skin, or the body. It was about times how you carried yourself asterisk. And yes, asterisk, how you smelled asterisk. Yes, indeed. The art of scent is next on our journey, as we continue to explore the strange and sometimes surreal beauty standards that shaped the lives of medieval women. Let us now shift our gaze from the soulful eyes that could melt the hearts of saints to the often overlooked aspect of beauty, the mouth. Ah, the mouth. While it may not have held the same reverence as the ethereal gaze or the fragile form, it too played a pivotal role in the medieval quest for beauty. And while the standards of the time may have considered an innocent, tearful gaze to be paramount, it also had to be accompanied by something equally vital to social interaction. Asterisk breath, asterisk. Sweet, pleasant breath, a fragrance that wasn't just nice to have, but essential for a woman who wished to maintain her virtuous appearance. But don't get too comfortable, because in the medieval world, breath was a tricky thing to maintain, and the methods for doing so were times far from sweet asterisk. Imagine this. You're at a medieval banquet. The air is thick with the sounds of lutes, gentle chatter, and the occasional clink of goblets. A noblewoman sits nearby, her delicate hands playing with a piece of bread, her lips painted with a light, modest sheen of rouge. But as you glance over, you notice that there's a certain unease times in the way she smiles. Oh, don't worry, it's not that she's unhappy. In fact, she's just as polite and poised as any other lady of the court. It's simply that, like many of her peers, her smile doesn't quite show her teeth. You see, in the medieval world, there was one unspoken rule that almost every noblewoman adhered to. Asterisk, the closed lip smile, asterisk. Now, you may wonder, why would anyone smile with their lips shut? Especially when the natural expression of joy would involve showing your teeth. The answer, my friend, is simple, but a bit times unsettling times, because times most medieval teeth were less than desirable asterisk. Imagine a time when dental hygiene was considered times optional, times at best, and times impractical times at worst. A time when the idea of brushing your teeth, much less using floss, was as distant as the stars. No toothpaste, no toothbrushes, no dental clinics offering preventative care. What you had to make do with, or in many cases, asterisk, make do without asterisk. Let us pause here and consider the state times of medieval teeth. Picture, if you will, a noble woman in all her finery. Her gown is elegant, her cheeks flushed with a gentle rouge, and her eyes are filled with soulful innocence. Yet, her teeth, well, those are a different matter entirely. They may be stained from a lifetime of eating foods that were sweetened with honey or molasses, both of which left their mark on the teeth like the ghosts of meals past. Or perhaps, like many others of her rank, she had indulged in sugary pastries and ale, which, in a world without toothpaste, left teeth yellowed and worn down by time. And let's not even get started on the effects of medieval diets, which were often heavy in bread and grains, which would break down into sticky, tooth-damaging starches. Without regular cleaning, those poor teeth were subject to decay, rot, and, at the very least, a serious case of bad breath. So, how did these poor souls go about making sure that their breath didn't offend the assembled crowd at a banquet? Why, they took matters into their own hands quite literally. The solution, as you might imagine, wasn't exactly what we'd call times high-tech asterisk. Women and men of the medieval era would often turn to herbs, chewed leaves, and sometimes even crude mouth rinses to freshen their breath. The most common remedies included chewing on herbs like parsley, fennel seeds, and cloves, ingredients that we still recognize today as natural breath fresheners. A small handful of these, chewed during the course of a meal, could temporarily mask the effects of a diet heavy on meats and alcohol. However, this method had its limitations. While parsley might have kept breath from smelling like a goat's pen, it didn't do much for the underlying causes of bad breath, like poor dental hygiene or the constant onslaught of sugary medieval snacks. But let's take it one step further. What about the more elaborate, often downright grotesque methods employed by the upper classes to ensure their mouths smelled as pristine as possible? We're talking about mouth rinses made from whatever ingredients the alchemists or local apothecaries could concoct. Often, these mouth rinses were made from vinegar or even wine asterisk, with herbs and spices thrown in for flavor and freshness. In some cases, more elaborate potions might include myrrh or sage. But it wasn't just about fresh breath. These concoctions often had to battle something more serious. The tooth decay that was rampant during this time. The medieval world didn't have fluoride, and most people didn't even know that plaque was a thing. So, when it came to mouth rinses, they were as much a desperate attempt to stave off tooth rot as they were a means to prevent bad breath. Now, let's talk about teeth asterisk. The fact is, white, even teeth were rare, asterisk, exceptionally rare in the medieval period. In an age when proper dental care was practically non-existent, teeth were more likely to be yellow, chipped, or downright missing asterisk. And if you did happen to have a full set of teeth, well, consider yourself lucky. Your pristine teeth would be a sign of not just health, but youth asterisk. White, even teeth were associated with young people and, more importantly, with those who could afford to be concerned with tooth decay from poor diet or lack of access to proper care. For the wealthy, teeth were not just functional, they were a sign of high status. If your teeth were even remotely intact and white, it meant that you had the leisure to maintain them, either by avoiding the foods that damaged them or by indulging in the occasional mouth-freshening remedy from a local apothecary. But for the vast majority of people, noble or otherwise, teeth were at times functional necessity asterisk, not something to be proud of. A noblewoman might have a mouth full of poorly kept teeth, but her wealth and high status were meant to mask that reality. After all, appearances were everything. A closed-lip smile was a way of showing that one had no need to show off one's teeth. No one needed to see the ravages of time or poor hygiene. The medieval noblewoman could smile with grace, and dignity asterisk, knowing that no one would be able to peek inside her mouth and discover her hidden dental flaws. The closed-lip smile, in a way, was a mask, just as the lead-based makeup on her face was a mask, and the soft, ethereal gown she wore was a mask. It was all about controlling what the world could see, and the mouth, with its imperfect, worn teeth, had no place in the display of medieval aristocracy. As for those who were less fortunate, the poor peasants and townsfolk, the story was often the same: bad teeth, bad breath, and little opportunity to fix it. The lower classes didn't have the luxury of expensive mouth rinses or fresh herbs to chew on. Instead, they might have turned to whatever local remedies were available, or simply endured the constant discomfort of having bad breath and bad teeth. With the lack of dental care, people often lived with the consequences of a sugar-heavy, starch-filled diet. And of course, as their teeth decayed, so too did their breath, until they had no choice but to keep their mouths closed when speaking, lest they offend those around them. The irony of all this, of course, is that the medieval world was obsessed with maintaining an ideal times, appearance times, yet when it came to the mouth, the reality was far less glamorous. The ideal was one of perfection, but the truth of everyday life was messier and more difficult to manage. Sweet breath and shiny teeth might have been the goal, but in the medieval world, it was far from a reality for most people. Those who could afford it used mouth rinses and herbs to keep things in check, while the rest of the population simply lived with what they had, navigating the world of bad teeth and bad breath as best they could. So, as you settle in for the night, perhaps reflect on how far we've come since those medieval days, when a polite, closed-lipped smile was the only way to navigate the oftentimes unpleasant times realities of medieval dental hygiene. As we move beyond the mouth, let's now explore yet another curious feature of medieval beauty: the fashion choices that were meant to cover, conceal, and enhance, whether we liked it or not. What awaited women was not just beauty in the form of skin and teeth, but in the very act of hiding what they truly were beneath layers and layers of fabric and ornamentation. As we've meandered through the labyrinth of medieval beauty standards, exploring the lengths to which noble women would go to maintain their delicate, almost ethereal appearance, it's only fair that we now take a step back and examine how the men of the medieval world fared in the beauty and hygiene department. After all, the concept of beauty wasn't reserved for the ladies alone, was it? No, indeed, medieval men had their own set of ideals to contend with. And just like their female counterparts, their beauty was as much about time's appearance times as it was about time's status asterisk. But while the ladies were obsessed with pale skin, delicate features, and tearful eyes, the men had their own particular brand of beauty that spoke more to composure, lean elegance, and, of course, the all-important times nobility asterisk. Let's begin by imagining the ideal medieval man. Picture him, lean, composed, with a graceful posture that speaks of someone who has never had to lift anything heavier than a goblet or a falcon. He walks with the confidence of someone who has inherited lands and titles, not of someone who has spent their days swinging a pickaxe or tending to the fields. His hair is neatly styled, falling in soft waves or curls, perfectly maintained by a team of squires or servants. And of course, his beard, a thing of artistry, is manicured and shaped to perfection. He doesn't look time's rough asterisk, like a farm laborer, nor does he look time's brutish asterisk, like a man who spends his days on the battlefield. No, he's neither the warrior nor the working man. He is something altogether more refined. A nobleman, the ideal medieval man, is a work of art in and of himself. His beauty is not in the strength of his body, but in the time's restraint times of his appearance. He is time's composed asterisk, the very picture of dignity and grace. The first thing you would notice about this man, the very first thing that would demand your attention, would be his hair. It's beautifully styled, of course. To be a medieval man of status meant that your hair wasn't merely something that grew on your head, it was a part of your identity, an extension of your rank. No wild, untamed locks here. Oh no, no. His hair is perfectly groomed, shaped by the hands of expert barbers or stylists who knew exactly how to create a look that spoke of sophistication and leisure. Whether it's slicked back, gently curled, or simply flowing with the kind of natural elegance that only wealth can afford, a nobleman's hair was meant to convey that he had the time, the resources, and the time's status times to care for it. These were men who didn't just grow hair, they maintained times it. And don't even get me started on the beard. The beard was a statement. If you were a medieval man of noble rank, your beard was a sign of your maturity, your wisdom, and, above all, your time's nobility asterisk. It was meticulously shaped, never too wild or unkempt. A scruffy beard might indicate that you were a peasant, or worse, a laborer. A beard that was times 2 times perfectly sculpted, however, might suggest that you were attempting too hard to display your nobility, which could be seen as pretentious. It was all about finding the times right, times balance. A nobleman's beard was the ideal mix of strength and softness, strong enough to demonstrate manhood and maturity, but soft enough to indicate that while you were a man, you were not a man of the soil. You weren't the brute who plowed fields or swung swords. No, you were the kind of man who had time to pamper his beard, to oil it, to shape it into an almost times artistic times expression of your noble identity. Now, I can hear you asking, what about hygiene? Ah, yes, hygiene, the ever-elusive concept in medieval times. When we think about hygiene today, we imagine daily showers, toothpaste, and freshly washed clothes. In medieval Europe, however, the idea of cleanliness was a little more. Asterisk, abstract asterisk. Bathing, for example, was not something that happened regularly, especially for the nobility. Contrary to what we might expect, these men weren't spending hours every day in the bath, scrubbing themselves with luxurious soaps and loofahs. No, bathing in the medieval world wasn't exactly a common pastime, particularly for those of the upper classes. You see, the act of bathing was often associated with the lower classes. The wealthy and noble were far too busy to spend time immersing themselves in water, especially since communal baths were often seen as public affairs, places where all manner of people gathered together, mixing the rich and the poor, and where hygiene was far less than optimal. In fact, by the later Middle Ages, bathing had fallen out of favor with the upper echelons of society, and was instead considered rather times suspicious asterisk. Bathhouses were often associated with disease and sin, and the notion of being times 2 clean times might even have seemed a bit times unnatural asterisk. But, of course, noblemen weren't completely times neglecting times their hygiene. Instead, they turned to other methods. Enter the pomander. These small scented orbs made of metal and filled with a mixture of herbs, spices, and perfumes were an essential accessory for any nobleman who wanted to maintain a fresh, pleasant scent without resorting to an actual bath. Picture it, a nobleman walking through the hallways of his grand estate, a delicate pomander dangling from his waist or hanging from his belt. It wasn't just a symbol of wealth, it was a times necessity asterisk. The pomander was filled with herbs like rosemary, cloves, and cinnamon, which helped mask any times natural odors times that might arise from a lack of proper bathing. The scent wafting from it was a sign that this man, while perhaps not taking daily baths, was at least times aware, times of the importance of scent, and, through his pomander, could ensure that his fragrance was always as refined as his posture. But let's not pretend that the nobles of medieval society were without their other tricks. The use of oils was also common, particularly scented oils. These oils, often infused with flowers or herbs, would be applied to the skin, especially in the winter months, when it was harder to keep fresh without a daily soak. These oils not only helped keep the skin from cracking or drying out, but also served as a way to maintain that times regal times scent. If you were a nobleman, you weren't just maintaining your appearance. You were also ensuring that your times presence times lingered in the room long after you'd gone. The perfume wasn't just for the ladies. It was a marker of a man who was refined, well-groomed, and always composed. A man who times didn't need to sweat asterisk. The key was in his scent a careful blend of herbs, oils, and sometimes even alcohol, mixed in such a way as to create an aura of times nobility. times that spoke louder than words. Yet, despite all these layers of preparation, be it the careful shaping of hair, the pomander swinging gently from his waist, or the oil that kept his skin soft, the true mark of a medieval nobleman was his time's composure asterisk. Hygiene wasn't just about cleanliness, it was about time's restraint asterisk. The ideal man wasn't the one who had a strong physique, the one whose muscles were honed from years of labor in the fields or on the battlefield. No, the ideal man was the one who managed to project strength without ever having to show times it. He was lean, but not muscular. He was composed, but never frantic. His beauty wasn't in the power of his body. It was in the control he exerted over his image. It was in his ability to look like a nobleman, regardless of how many days had passed since his last bath. But as with all things in the medieval world, beauty standards were often tied to time's moral virtue asterisk. Hygiene was not simply a matter of cleanliness, it was about demonstrating restraint, a quality that was highly prized in a society that valued ordered times above all else. A nobleman's grooming habits were a reflection of his ability to maintain composure, even in the most trying of circumstances. A man who bathed regularly might be seen as self-indulgent, whereas a man who managed to maintain an air of refinement without excess times was seen as morally superior. His ability to not bathe, to not overindulge in the luxuries of cleanliness was a mark of his moral fortitude. Restraint was the true beauty, the true measure of virtue. As we look back on these medieval beauty standards of pomanders, oils, and restraint, we see how much of what was considered beautiful times had little to do with actual cleanliness or health. It was all about appearance, composure, and the ability to project an image of strength and virtue, all while avoiding the natural signs of excess. While medieval men didn't have the modern conveniences we take for granted today, they had their own ways of making sure they were seen as time's noble asterisk, refined asterisk, and, above all, in control. Now that we've explored the intricacies of male beauty and hygiene, let's take a moment to reflect on how these standards influenced society. Beauty was never just about looking good, it was about how you looked, and what that said about who you were. Whether it was the women striving for that angelic, tearful gaze, or the men perfecting their pomanders and beards, the medieval world was a place where appearances were deeply tied to social status, and every brush of the comb or dab of perfume was a message in itself. As we drift gently toward the end of our journey, the soft hum of medieval beauty standards still lingers in the air, like the faintest scent of lavender on a summer evening. We've navigated the winding, sometimes eerie paths of paleness, perfumed pomanders, and delicate foreheads. And now, as we prepare to close our eyes and rest, it's time to reflect on the fascinating world we've explored. The medieval obsession with beauty, like a quiet song from another time, was more than just skin deep. It was woven into the very fabric of society's values, beliefs, and aspirations. Medieval beauty was not a simple thing, nor was it about the superficial allure of a delicate complexion or perfectly styled hair. Oh no, it was a profound reflection of class, morality, and religion, all tangled together in an intricate dance. The ideals of beauty in the Middle Ages were, in many ways, an outward expression of an inner world that prized purity, restraint, and virtue and, at the same time, feared the temptation of vanity, sin, and excess. The standards of beauty were, in fact, almost entirely bound to one's position in life. Your skin, your posture, the way you wore your hair, even the way you smiled, told the world everything about times, who times you were, and times what times you were worth. It was a mirror reflecting not only your personal appearance, but also the moral landscape of the time. Let us pause for a moment, imagining ourselves once again in that medieval world. Picture the ladies and gentlemen, with their porcelain faces, delicate brows, and perfectly groomed appearances, walking with grace through grand halls, their every move steeped in restraint. To maintain such beauty was no simple feat, no quiet matter of vanity. Achieving the times, ideal times, meant enduring suffering, some of it slow, some of it painful. White lead, arsenic, and vinegar were common allies in the pursuit of that radiant, ghostly skin, and the faintest trace of blush, when applied, often came with a dangerous price. Yet, despite the looming threat of toxicity and illness, the pursuit of beauty was not so easily abandoned. The ideals of beauty, those soft, translucent cheeks, the ethereal air of fragility, were symbols of time's nobility, of being untouched by the harshness of the world. To be pale and delicate was to say, I am of a higher class, free from the toils of labor and the Sunday. Beauty was, in fact, a time's moral statement. In medieval Europe, it wasn't simply about what was pretty, but what was time's pure. To be beautiful was to be virtuous, to be morally upright, and to be time's chosen by God. But here's the twist: there was a fine line between beauty as a sign of virtue and beauty as a sign of vanity. The times, same time's beauty that represented purity, holiness, and restraint, could quickly slip into the realm of sin if it was overindulged in. The very things that made a person beautiful, that delicate, smooth complexion, the carefully crafted high forehead, or the dainty, perfect smile, could also make them dangerously close to being accused of vanity, pride, or worse, temptation. It was a tightrope walk, one that required delicate balance and, above all, restraint. When we step back and look at this tapestry of beauty standards, it's impossible not to be struck by how strangely intertwined these ideals were with religion and class. For the medieval aristocracy, beauty wasn't just a personal preference, it was a moral duty. In a time when social mobility was limited and life was often short and brutal, your beauty, your appearance, was the time's only times thing that could communicate your worth to the world. For the wealthy and noble, it wasn't enough to simply exist. They needed to appear as though they were times above, times the demands of daily life, untouched by the struggles of the common folk. The unattainable beauty standards they set for themselves became a way to demonstrate their separation from the hardships of labor, from the dirty realities of the outside world. And yet, with all this beauty, there was a constant tension between time's aesthetic times and time's moral time's judgment. The same perfection that was meant to convey virtue could also be seen as a dangerous act of pride or self-worship. To some, a woman who adorned herself too much, who spent too much time on her appearance, was a woman who was courting disaster. The church was quick to remind people that vanity was a sin, and while the idea of beauty as a divine blessing could be celebrated, it was easy to cross the line into time's excess times, and with that excess, the threat of damnation. Even in the midst of all this pursuit of beauty, there was an underlying fear that perhaps it was all a little too much, a little too close to the edge of sinful pride. So, as we reflect on the medieval pursuit of beauty, we can see that it was more than just a way to be times seen. Times it was about being times understood. To be beautiful was not simply to be admired, but to be admired in the times right, times way. The medieval ideal demanded that beauty come with a sense of modesty, restraint, and above all, moral times uprightness asterisk. Beauty had to be subtle, a quiet whisper of divine approval, not a loud declaration of one's superiority. The danger of excess, of flaunting one's beauty for the sake of vanity, was always present, lurking in the background. Now, as we prepare to close our eyes and slip into the soft embrace of sleep, it's worth considering this final thought. The standards of beauty we've explored, with all their strangeness and contradictions, are not as distant from us as they may seem. In fact, beauty standards, whether medieval or modern, are always strange times, mirrors times of society's values, desires, and fears. What was considered beautiful in medieval times says as much about the anxieties of that society as it does about the time's ideal times itself. In the same way, the beauty standards we see today reflect our own complex relationship with class, morality, and identity. The pursuit of perfection, of external beauty, is a never-ending dance between self-expression and societal expectation, a reflection of what we value, what we fear, and what we believe defines us. So, as you lay your head down and allow the weight of the day to gently fade away, remember that beauty, in all its forms, has always been more than skin deep. It has always been a way for us to communicate who we are, who we times want times to be, and perhaps who we are times afraid times to be. And as we fall into the quiet stillness of sleep, let us acknowledge that these standards, strange and flawed as they may be, are merely the surface of something much deeper, an ongoing reflection of the complex tapestry of human nature. A tapestry that, just like medieval beauty, may be full of contradictions, but is undeniably ours times to navigate, understand, and, perhaps, even change. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with serene beauty, free from judgment and full of grace.